So further to that, and I've been quite busy over the last year or so trying to, in the very limited time that I actually have, write a few articles here and there for newspapers and magazines. One of which happened to be, I was very lucky to have been read by the Radio New Zealand reporter Kim Hill, who then invited me onto his show in the latter part of the year, last year, for a chat. And it turned out to be a really fruitful experience, and you can still download that talk today. Generated a whole ton of feedback, just tons and tons of responses during and after the interview, and a whole lot of really useful connections for me were made afterwards as well. And I just want to share some of that public feedback from that interview now as a sort of lead-in to what I want to talk to you about further today. So here's some of the nice things that people said during the conversation with Kim Hill. One of the most common themes that people expressed was that they found that the conversation was refreshing, that it was good to have someone talking outside of the norm in conservation. And here's some of the not-so-nice ones. People often thought that it was poor form to show any kind of support for many species of introduced wildlife, and they were often quite defensive of their biodiversity. And for many people, there's some good ones out there, their biodiversity was often taken to be native biodiversity almost exclusively. And the last quote there is probably the most symptomatic, I suppose, of the various phobias and anxieties people have about introduced species in New Zealand. So that they want to pull the lever and drop this guy down the chute, let him feed the Norwegian rats in the pit. So, we have some real poets out there in the community. But again, it just underlines the difficulties we can have with having conversations in this space. A lot of people are very afraid at the prospect that our views in this space may change over the coming decades. Here's a few more of the same. These ones are mostly directed at the poor old possum. Honestly, if you want to provoke a New Zealander, tell them that that you love a possum, or even that you're indifferent towards possums. It tends to elicit the most visceral and unfortunately often xenophobic responses, even from usually quite measured people. So these sorts of furious, I would say at times quasi-religious passions for conservation often characterise our discussions about nature in New Zealand. And a lot of them really do, in my experience, emanate from the top down, whether it be from academics, from politicians, and from many senior managers as well. And so, as I've already mentioned, it makes it very difficult to have conversations about conservation in New Zealand. New Zealanders in general tend to have this very with us or against us attitude when it comes to conservation. You either agree that this is the right way to do it, or you're my enemy, and there's very little room in between. Predator-Free New Zealand, the government's endorsement of it recently, is a good example of that. For a lot of people, you're either really ambitious and you're imaginative and you've got these great ideas about predator-free and it's going to be this wonderful thing, or you're a denier, you're a dissenter, you're a contrarian, you're a loser, if you want to raise any kind of objections. It's deeply concerning to me that the most frequent comment that I got from my positive feedback on that Kim Hill interview, aside from refreshing, was that people thought that I was brave. They thought that I was courageous even. And while it's very flattering to hear those kinds of things, what they're essentially saying is that you'd need to be brave to talk about our basic assumptions and objectives for conservation in New Zealand, even when doing so, as I was, through the most orthodox channels possible, in this case through PhD research. And to me, that really demonstrates how unbalanced we've got in New Zealand and how far, in some respects, from the bounds of reasonable and considered conversation we've strayed. People in the industry in particular are afraid that they will lose funding or even their employment if they offer different views on conservation. And I think that many of them are very well justified in their fears. It's a real problem we have in this country. It's a real sacred cow, and it's something that I think that we need to be talking about more, both as an industry and as a society. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to offer up 10 different beliefs, if you will, assumptions, understandings, whatever you want to talk about, whatever you want to consider them to be, about conservation in New Zealand, and as discussion points moving forward, and provide you with some thoughts on each of those. And again, I'll just reiterate that this isn't a summary of my PhD research. I wouldn't want to draw you through that, though of course it does draw on it to some extent. I'm going to be pretty superficial with my treatment of each of these different things, knowing that I'm not going to be able to give any of them much justice. They're all going to be set up as straw men, if you like. But in many respects, I see that as a good thing because it then gives us the freedom after this presentation and moving forward, I suppose, that that you can offer different thoughts on this sort of stuff and try to promote a little bit more banter in general. And I don't know, maybe I'm wrong about some of these things. I'm not saying that there's necessarily one right way to think about this stuff. But what I would say is that if I'm right, or at least I'm in the ballpark with at least one or two of these things, then it might mean that we should give a little bit more of these conversations some more time and space.